Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope you've all put away your dictionaries, because I pride myself on, I hope, being able to communicate without troubling you to have to figure out what I'm trying to say, because then the purpose of communication will not be served. But I do want to stress, of course, that if there is a word I use, somebody just came up and said, "Aap to bade bhayankar Angrezi bolte hain." So in that case, I hope that the context of the statement or the argument I make will make it all be a good deal less bhayankar. But anyway, it's good to be at the 10th Auto Summit to discuss the challenges and opportunities that all of you are facing as you look towards this theme of controlling our destiny, something we all would like to do. I think that the whole notion of controlling our destiny is a powerful one. Politicians want to control their own destiny, but our destiny is in the hands of the voters. I suppose for automobile dealers, your destiny in many ways is in the hands of the manufacturers, and their destiny is in the hands of the trends in the industry. So we have a rather long set of issues that we need to look at. And if you look at the world since the volatility that burst upon us in the last 10 years, the dot-com boom and bust, the economic slowdown of 2009, the social media revolution, the Uberification of traditional services. Suddenly, instead of just hailing a taxi in the street, you could call one that didn't look like a taxi, but had a different concept to operate. Instead of booking a hotel, you could go on a website and find a place for yourself. All of this has given us a very different set of realities to contend with. So, in all of this, and while we're talking about words beginning with auto, it's not only automobile these days, it's also automation. And where that's going to lead us has also become a good question. So, how can we control our destiny? The theme you've given me in the context of all of these developments. Now, I realize I'm not the most typical speaker for a conference of vehicle dealers and manufacturers and industry bodies, and that some of you might well be wondering what exactly you may gain from listening to me. And I thought that maybe in the spirit of today's 21st century management speak, we need to have a few takeaway points that I should leave you with when I make my remarks. The only thing is that I didn't know how many points to give you. They've given me an awful lot of time to address you all. So I said, well, you know, there was the famous 14 points that President Woodrow Wilson announced to end the First World War. And when he mentioned his 14 points, the French president, Georges Clemenceau, responded, 14 points. Even the good God only needed 10. So since I'm not going to compete with either Wilson or Clemenceau or the good Lord, I'm going to try and make just 6 propositions to illustrate my theme of the challenges and volatility of the world today and some of the responses that we in India, and you in particular, might wish to be aware of. So the first point, obviously, is the one I've already hinted at, the extent of globalization and the influence upon us of global forces and the constant change and uncertainty that bedevils them. You know, when I left for graduate school in the US way back in 1975, the word globalization was unknown. It wasn't in use anywhere. Crossing borders was still a big deal, getting a US visa and that precious allowance of $8 that you were allowed to take out of the country. And I arrived in America where to be an Indian still carried the whiff of the exotic, with most Americans thinking of India in terms of snake charmers, fakirs lying on beds of nails, or at best, Maharajas on caparisoned elephants. Then, of course, Globalization became widespread, migrations followed, the phenomenon began to infect our everyday lives everywhere. Our most commonplace headlines today reek of globalization. It was just last year that the world had all that spate of articles commemorating the 20th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. Now, what, you may ask, has that got to do with globalization? Well, here it is, very simple. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with her Egyptian companion, who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese scooters into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and today the whole story is being told to you in New Delhi by the Indian MP for Thiruvananthapuram. There's globalization. But jokes apart, obviously, issues that once would have seemed very far away are now very much in our backyard. The Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers have illustrated that even political leaders are no longer invulnerable behind their borders. Both in Iceland and in Pakistan, a prime minister had to resign because of a leak of papers far, far away in the Bahamas. A single data leak can create widespread geopolitical disruptions. It can similarly trigger a major sell-off in the global stock markets. As Arun Jaitley yesterday very rightly said, in responding to our criticisms of the stock market's reaction to his budget, he said, considering that the Dow Jones has also collapsed, the London stock market has fallen, Wall Street is down, Germany's stock exchange is down, do you think that all these stock exchanges have fallen because of my speech in Delhi? And he was right. I mean, very clearly, there is a global tendency, and perhaps ours is also a part of that. On the other hand, perhaps in Delhi, in Bombay, we do listen to the finance minister's speech in Delhi, so it may well have had something to do with it. But the fact is that whatever happens, whether it happens in East Asia or Southern Africa, protectionist policies, deforestation, fight against climate change, increasing desertification, illnesses and diseases, all sorts of things, these can affect our lives wherever we live, even here in northern India. Our own choices anywhere, what we buy, how we vote, can resound far away. Donald Trump's election and the Brexit vote in Britain may both have been based principally on purely domestic considerations of the voters. But their after effects have impacted so many people in so many countries around the world. So the truth is, as someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We all get affected by decisions made somewhere else. Some think that the stream can be dammed up and walls built, but damming up these streams could simply lead to a calamitous overflow, and walls will only provoke people to build tunnels under them. Now, when we think of the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, we're thinking specifically of things like IT, the information technology revolution that's brought to our breakfast tables and our living rooms, and of course to our computers and our mobile phones, snippets of information, images, glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. Forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We also should be conscious of the changes that terrorism and conflict have also wrought in the world. The aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, the wars in Iraq and Syria, Yemen and elsewhere. And for us, the problems inflicted on us, not just symbolized by 26/11, but before and after 26/11 by our next door neighbors in Pakistan. Now, these are all forces of divergence that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between north and south, between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. So when I spoke of the forces of convergence that globalization represents, and the divergence that we have seen through terrorism, bigotry, religious hatred, conflict, we have this paradox in today's world that there are forces that are pushing us together, and simultaneously there are forces that are pulling us apart, both more so than ever before. And to my mind, this is an extremely challenging paradox of our times. One may argue, in fact, at this point, that the forces of divergence seem to have more wind in their sails than those of convergence, because what we are seeing more and more is talk of anti-globalization. The numbers speak for themselves. In 2007, global cross-border capital inflows reached a record high of $12.4 trillion. In 2016, which is 9 years later, thanks to the global financial crisis, the flow of capital had dropped to 4.3 trillion, which was just about 1/3 of the 2007 levels. So just in terms of numbers, the world has gone back decades, because the numbers I'm talking about are comparable to what were the numbers back in 1980, which is when globalization can be said to have begun. So countries that used to flourish through exports, through global trade, they've suddenly had to find their economy shrinking, and they needed to look to other means of growth than relying purely on global trade. Singapore is a very good example. 186% of its GDP came from trade. Today, that has shrunk, and they're beginning very quickly to develop new industries to be able to find ways of staying ahead in the global economy. Now, of course, there's no doubt that globalization has made the world a better, safer, more prosperous place. But the manner in which the benefits of globalization have been distributed has been quite uneven. In the developed world, for example, populist objections have arisen to globalization in its current avatar. And when you speak of anti-globalization, you're really speaking of two distinct kinds of backlash. And they don't always overlap, though sometimes they do. First is the economic backlash. It's obvious, for example, that China has brought lots of economic benefits to Western consumers by exporting so much to the Western countries, but it's equally true that workers in the Western countries have lost their jobs in the process. Now, the response from Western leaders has been one of increasing denunciation of global trade. There's been hostility and even violence towards foreigners. And there's been the imposition of austerity measures in Western countries, particularly European countries, which usually tends to hurt the poor more. The poor and the unemployed then feel they have no stake in the globalized system. They demand to know why government policies in their countries should be benefiting workers in China. And they're saying these jobs that the Chinese are doing used to be our jobs. So they want their leaders, and they're voting this way, to bring them back to the security of the older economy, more familiar economic ways, in which each generation assumed that they would earn more and have a better life and a bigger house and a bigger car than their parents did. So that's broadly the economic backlash, and you're seeing that strongly in the election of Trump. You're seeing that in the strong responses that you've seen in many Western countries against globalization. But there is a second backlash, and that is what I call the cultural backlash. That is a backlash against cosmopolitanism, against multiculturalism, against immigration coming into their societies, against foreigners generally, whether the foreigners are in foreign countries or the foreigners have now come to their countries. And people have begun in this cultural backlash, in some cases to piggyback on the economic backlash, and in some cases to go beyond it. So when Mr. Trump said, "Make America great again," he was also hinting, "Make America white again." But that isn't going to happen, because in fact, demographics are irresistible. Whatever happens, the majority of the American labor force by 2030 will be non-white. They'll be able to do nothing to change that. The whites will all be retiring and dying away. I mean, not all, but the majority. So in this situation, People saying we speak for a more authentically, culturally rooted nationalism are getting support. Brexit definitely was partly about that. People voting against hearing foreign languages in the streets in England. Marine Le Pen in France getting 34%. These are all signs, and the rise of a basically neo-Nazi party in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, which has come third in the elections in Germany. All of this suggests that you are seeing the rise of phenomena that reflect a cultural backlash. Now, there's some very interesting exceptions to it being the same in both countries. If you look at some of the so-called emerging markets, countries like Turkey or India, we have leaders, whether it's Mr. Erdogan there or Mr. Modi here, who are very much representatives of the cultural backlash, who speak in terms of a more religious identity for their nation, who speak in terms of a more authentic nationalism, but they are not part of the economic backlash. They want to be Davos man, they don't want to reject Davos man, unlike the Trump voters or the Brexit voters. Now, this is the very interesting change that has overcome globalization today. And one of the big ironies is that the very countries that used to preach to us about globalization, the very countries that spoke about the importance of the free movement of goods, labor, and capital, and were lecturing to us, to countries like India, they are the ones where now protectionism is on the rise, and literally and metaphorically walls are going up in those countries. So globalization, as we knew it, is in trouble. And that brings me to my second point, that while it may appear that anti-globalization will create doom and disruption, my own view is that globalization is not retreating, but is merely in the throes of a major structural readjustment. What shape that adjustment will take is still impossible to foretell. I've always argued that obituaries for globalization are premature. We're not about to unravel the internet or cut the connections that allow us to move billions with the pulse of a cursor, or call back the jet planes, or switch off the satellite dishes. None of that is going to be happening. Our connections are irreversible, even if the policies that sustain them can be temporarily halted, or even if the countries, as I mentioned earlier, that were the principal cheerleaders of globalization have become the very ones that are betraying the principles that they preached to us for the last 3 decades. But one of the key determinants in what shapes the New World Order will be how businesses and states across the world figure out how they can keep pace with the rapid technological changes that are around the corner. For one, technological changes in energy production are relevant to your industry, because if you look at shale oil and gas, when oil crosses a certain dollar figure, some say it's $64, some say it's $48 a barrel, then shale oil and gas become economically viable. And then that means that more oil comes on stream, prices drop again, and once again, that has an effect on the vulnerability of states who depend on these. I mentioned earlier that in the world of automobiles, you have to think of automation. Automation of the workplace, robotization, and developments in artificial intelligence are happening. And it's going to make it very hard to create jobs for growing numbers of young people. Mr. Modi is rightly pitching Make in India, but he may have already missed the boat, because he is doing so in an era in which many manufactured goods may not only not be made in India, but may not be made by human beings anywhere. They may be made by robots, by automation, using AI. More disruptions are inevitable. Self-driving cars will be of great interest to all of you in your profession. Robotic service personnel are coming on stream in countries like Japan. Artificial intelligence systems that replace human beings, replace financial analysts, replace paralegals, replace copy editors. You know, technology is ending medical transcription. Many of you, if I had made a speech to you a few conventions ago, I would have proudly talked about how an American doctor, at the end of seeing his patients, at the end of a day, will dictate his notes into a dictaphone. It'll be zinged over to a qualified medical professional in India who will type it up while the American doctor is sleeping, somebody who understands medical terms and can type up the case notes. And when the doctor comes back to work in America in the morning, he has perfectly typed medical notes of his day's patients. That used to be a very thriving business. We invented that business in India. That business, my friends, is disappearing because now voice recognition software has reached a point where the same American doctor can dictate the same notes into a microphone, and the text will show up on his computer screen instantly without his having to wait for somebody in India to type it. The medical field is particularly affected. MRIs. You know that many people would have their MRIs in Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston and have to wait for it to be read by a qualified radiologist in India for 1/8 the price that a radiologist would charge in America. Now artificial intelligence systems are reading MRIs. So technology is changing a lot of these things, and you have to understand that this is not going to be exempting any profession, including yours. Meanwhile, we have the other side, as I mentioned, convergence and disruption. You have cyber crime, you have cyber espionage, cyber terrorism. Disruption is absolutely inevitable, therefore. Imagine if self-driving cars came to India. I'm not suggesting this is an imminent possibility. Though inevitably the entire world manages to switch to self-driving cars, we may not be able to stay in our cocoon for much longer. But if they did, just as a thought experiment, what happens to the 22 million Indians whose only profession is driving? Whether they're driving your cars to bring you here, whether they're driving lorries and trucks to take goods across the country, what happens when they're no longer needed? This is a major socioeconomic calamity in a country where already we don't have enough jobs for the people born and coming of age to work. Now, I believe it will therefore be something that you in automobile, retail, and manufacturing will have to be conscious of both the opportunities and the complications. New forms of shared mobility are being talked about, where car ownership patterns could very well change. There are already people describing in America a vision in which nobody would own a personal car anymore because you'll just punch a number in your phone and within 2 minutes a self-driving car will show up at your door and take you where you want to go. And there will already be the equivalence of ride-sharing technology, where if 6 people are choosing the same destination from roughly the same area, the car will make all the necessary stops, pick the people up, and share the cost with you. Now, all of this kind of thing, autonomous vehicles are entirely within the realm of possibility. They're obviously not yet on all the roads, but this is likely to happen, and it's going to be transforming lives. It'll change rural life in these countries. It'll change congestion in inner cities. It may obviate the need for parking, except for the car companies that actually are sending out these self-driving cars. All of these things would create headwinds in your profession, in your industry, and I think creative solutions will be required. So the job creation debate in the automotive industry is going to be a very important one. You played for a long time a critical role in the Indian economy. You contributed 7.1% to the country's GDP in 2016. You are expected to provide employment to over 15 million people directly, so I'm not counting those drivers, just in the industry itself by 2022, and of course indirectly many millions more. And so adapting to technological changes will have to be a key driver to employment generation in your field and in the country as a whole. At the same time, business leaders must also be cautioned about the potential harm that technological changes can bring to our employment landscape. I saw somebody here from EY. They did a study in partnership with FICCI and NASSCOM last year, which showed that in the automobile industry, 10 to 15% of the current workforce will face an existential threat to their jobs by 2022, principally, of course, because of the rapid pace of technological innovation. Now, this is in addition to the 50 to 55% of the workforce that is likely to have to be redeployed to jobs very different from their existing work profiles. And therefore, every person in the workforce is going to need a different skill set from what they've had before. The scale of disruption at hand may even cause a pushback from voters, from citizens. Because, you know, one of the complacent answers you always get from the advocates of technology is, bhai, what's new in all this? It's always been the case. When automobiles were invented, they remind you, there was a big crisis at all the buggy whip manufacturers. A buggy whip was a whip used by the driver of the buggy who used to flog the horses, and the horses used to drag people down the streets, right? Once a car came, you didn't need the buggies, you didn't need the buggy whips. Thousands of people lost their jobs. And the question that came up therefore was, how on earth are you going to manage? Well, the answer is the world managed. It couldn't stop automobiles. Similarly, when movies, which were all silent movies for the first 20 years or so, suddenly became talkies, when people figured out how to put a soundtrack on a film, what happened? Thousands of musicians lost work because every single movie theater had a live orchestra playing music to accompany the film. Literally tens of thousands of musicians lost work. So people say, look, this has happened before, it'll happen again, don't worry. I wish I could be reassured. I mean, in many ways, it's entirely possible that new professions will come up. If a robot is doing what human beings used to do, then human beings will perhaps discover jobs to service those robots. I don't know. But it may not be the same people. The ones who've lost their jobs today may not be the ones doing the new jobs tomorrow. And for them, they are not only the ones whose lives have been disrupted. From a politician's point of view, they are the angry voters blaming the politicians for having cost them their livelihood. So all of this, you can't, of course, stop change. Change is inevitable, but be prepared for market and policy volatility. We've already seen in our country and in other countries such an interesting backlash against Uber. And the backlash may have been out of proportion to whatever sins Uber has committed. It's also partially the difficulty of any policy system to adjust to this kind of disruptive technological change. So while it's impossible to predict exactly what this readjustment of globalization that I talked about will represent, it's imperative that states and businesses prepare for the inevitable. That means investing in policies, institutions, industries, skill development that will enable you to cope with these disruptions wrought by technological change. Responsible leadership and technological innovation in the automobile industry and beyond will be key to both driving growth and spreading its fruits equally. And that connects to my third point, which is that to control our destiny, as the organizers call for, to navigate this readjustment and overcome our society's long-standing problems, we have to constantly seek quality solutions across the board. The quality is obviously a key core value for any individual product, company, or country to succeed. Indeed, the balancing act of maintaining both efficiency and quality in everything one does is the most important and most unavoidable task. The very idea of quality emerges from a basic human desire to excel. And this is pretty fundamental, right? I mean, the moment a baby is born, the parents' expectations immediately change. Until the baby is born, all you want is, may God please give us a healthy, normal baby. And immediately after the baby is born, may the baby become Einstein or at least Sachin Tendulkar. I mean, we all want excellence. We want to create and produce and raise superman or women who would excel in everything that the parents could possibly hope a child can do. So the minute the concept of quality touches your life, you are immediately inspired and motivated to raise the bar. You want to go beyond your current capabilities to target and achieve excellence. And that is what it seems to me is so important. The well-known management guru Philip Crosby said about quality, quality is the result of a carefully constructed cultural environment. It has to be the fabric of the organization, not just part of the fabric. Now that's a big challenge for all of us in India, because our culture is not necessarily always quality-oriented. Our culture is not always, as a country, oriented towards excellence. In what ways can we inculcate a determination for quality as we try to identify solutions to our old traditional issues? And look, the problems of India haven't changed for decades, right? We still haven't fully managed to provide our Aam Aadmi with roti, kapda or makan, which we've been talking about for 7 decades. They made a movie with that title in 1974. We still have large numbers of people who are looking for, who need roti, kapda or makan. Then by the 21st century, we have new prerequisites. We have bijli, sadak aur pani. Those have not been provided everywhere. And increasingly one can add naukri, kitab, I hope, as a writer, but if not kitab, certainly broadband internet. We're now living in India where 4G is more important than Modi ji. So in this situation, the wish list keeps growing. Every ordinary citizen wants all this. But I would argue we can do it. And each one of us in India is capable of rising to the challenge of finding that quality in our performance and achieving it. I'm always inspired by the story from the 1890s of the great Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata, who was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay because there was a sign outside saying Indians and dogs not allowed. And he was thrown out of the hotel. So he went off and built a far greater, far more opulent, far more luxurious hotel that was open to Indians, the Taj Mahal Palace. I don't know what happened to the dogs, but the Indians could certainly go in. And today, not only is the Taj considered one of the finest hotels in the world, but, of course, Pike's has long since closed. So what is striking to me is that we have created a brand which has a global reputation in the hospitality industry out of the experience of one man being kicked out of a whites-only hotel. Mahatma Gandhi created a worldwide message after being kicked out as a non-white from a first-class carriage in South Africa. So being kicked out, being denied, being excluded can actually be a spur for us to do greater and better things. You know, let me go back to Mr. Tata again. He was trying to set up India's first steel mill. For decades, the British tried to thwart him at every respect. India's first modern steel mill. We had steel industry before the British destroyed it. But then what happened was that he encountered all this implacable British hostility, and a colonial official, the then chairman of the railway board, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. You know, I only wish that that official had lived long enough to see the descendants of the same Mr. Tata whom he tried to block purchasing the remnants of British steel when he bought Chorus just 10, 15 years ago. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. And some of you, at least those who are applauding, might remember the WhatsApp meme that went around after the 2015 elections in Britain, when the then newly elected, now already former Prime Minister David Cameron went off to Buckingham Palace to claim his new mandate. And all the Indians were saying, look at the British Prime Minister. He's going in an Indian-owned car, a Jaguar, escorted by police in another Indian-owned car, a Land Rover, to get his firman from the British Queen. And that, I think, is enough to send a post-colonial thrill through us. But what I'm saying is really that this ability to challenge the status quo, this ability to build sustainable and quality solutions is key. I mean, no one is going to be restricted into a hotel in the 21st century because of their skin color or their gender or their religion. But the challenge of making the world safe for diversity. You know, in the First World War, Wilson's slogan was, let's make the world safe for democracy. That's probably happened to a great extent. Can we make the world safe for diversity? Can there be room for all of us from different kinds of backgrounds? The new glass ceilings are not a hotel lobby, but they're a company boardroom. They're sometimes a job opportunity within a company itself. What some people fail to understand is that the lack of diversity that they're bringing into their own companies, into their own workforces, can sometimes inhibit their success. It can restrict your ability to discuss a problem from multiple perspectives, and therefore prevent you from delivering a better quality solution. So it would be very helpful to get multiple voices into your own companies, into your own enterprises. As an Indian, as a Congress MP, I'm not here to make a political speech, but I can certainly say that diversity is an undeniable value in terms of our image abroad, because I happen to be not in politics. I was at the UN. Way back in 2004, I was traveling in the Gulf countries for the UN, and I remember being struck by the astonishment and admiration with which the Arab officials I met were reacting to the news that the elections in India had resulted in a victory for a political party led by a woman of Italian background and Catholic faith, who then made way for a Sikh to become prime minister and to be sworn in by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. That, for them, was astonishing. And I had to say to them, we're not doing this to impress you. This is how we are. This is India being itself. That management of diversity we have in India is striking. Even in America, till 2008 and Barack Obama, 220 years of free and fair elections, they never elected a president or a vice president who wasn't white, male, and Christian. So it took them that long to achieve the kind of diversity that we have been able to promote in India today. And because different perspectives, different experiences are extremely important, it seems to me very, very vital that we ensure that people who are aspiring to leadership in this changing world recognize that you must look beyond the obvious, beneath the surface, get the comments, the perspective of people of different backgrounds. Remember, there's always more than one side to a story, always more than one answer to a question. And I say this, I'm conscious, having collected a number of cards from many of you, that many of you in this industry bear illustrious family names, and your families have been in this industry for several generations. The risk of that is some entrenched ways of thinking. Those of us who are criticized for running dynasties in our political parties cannot accuse you of running a dynasty in your automobile dealerships or your companies. But the truth is that one of the dangers would be if you don't promote different points of view in the desire to run the companies the way it's always been run. So make sure we see differences as strengths and not as weaknesses. And that brings me to my fourth point, which is that, of course, mechanisms that encourage unconventional thinking, that build quality solutions, require us to encourage creativity everywhere. We talk about the demographic dividend all the time, but the fact is that to create this bright talent pool in our country, we absolutely require not just educated, motivated individuals. We need people who are prepared to think out of the box. Brand India is not going to be built only on old-fashioned ways of doing business. We have to absolutely encourage the proliferation of micro, small, medium-level entrepreneurial ventures, give them a chance to grow, to flourish, and to come up with their own ideas. In our country, and therefore in your companies as well, I would argue, we need to encourage small groups of self-organizing and motivated individuals to take the opportunities and the resources, not just to ideate, but to test their ideas in the real world. Some will succeed, some will fail, but they will energize our economy and they'll throw up the best available minds and talents to lead India forward into the 21st century. The answer, obviously, is in giving a free rein to entrepreneurship at every possible level. And that requires the right mindset. I'm trying to race through the last few points because I realize we have taken a bit too long on the first few. So let me go quickly to the fifth. I think the fourth was fairly self-explanatory. I don't need to give you too many examples. While innovation through entrepreneurship is important, it's not a means to an end alone by itself, because we have to target efficiency and quality that I've mentioned to stay relevant and to transform industries. You folks have done a wonderful job just by getting together. 10 years in a row, you are meeting, you are sharing experiences, you're discussing ideas, you're learning new things, you're thinking afresh. This is wonderful. And the fact that you've only been doing it for 10 years, while automobiles have been in India for 100 years, shows that you've woken up to the need for this just in time, right? So I'm very pleased that it's there, and it's encouraging that Indian examples are being studied abroad. The Dabbawalas of Mumbai, Sulabh International, Lalu Prasad Yadav's railway reforms are all being studied in Harvard Business School. So the truth is that higher education is waking up to the need for India, and our indigenous business practices have worked in some places. We all hear so much about Jugaad that I won't keep repeating it. But the truth is that it's not just Jugaad. I was invited in 2011 to inaugurate the India Innovation Center at the University of Toronto in Canada. And the buzzword there was not so much Jugaad, but Indovation, for Indian innovation. And one of the things about innovation was that it was geared to the realities of our economy, our challenges of poverty, scarcity, frugality. You just Google the phrase frugal innovation, and you will find the first 20 hits all relate to India and to Indian innovations. I mean, I know many of you probably are fairly frustrated about the most famous Indian innovation, which of course in your business is the Tata Nano. You know, when it was first brought out into the market, it cost roughly the same as a high-end DVD player in a Western car, in a luxury car. And what's interesting is there is no DVD player in the Nano, no radio either in the basic model, but its innovations have gathered 34 patents. And it's not merely the result of doing away with frills, including power brakes, air conditioning, side view mirrors even, but clever things like reducing the use of steel by inventing an aluminum engine, increasing space by moving the wheels to the edge of the chassis, relying on a modular design that enables a car to be assembled from kits. All of this proved you could do more with less, and this is, in a sense, a clever way of jugaad. I know for you it was a marketing disaster, but that was because the marketing message was wrong. It was sold as the cheapest car. Who wants to be seen driving the cheapest car? Right? I mean, in our country now, Indians are famously aspirational. If it had been sold as the most innovative car, the car that took the Geneva Auto Salon by storm, it might have been a success today. But the point is not that. The point is those innovations are something we need to focus on and celebrate. To my mind, we must find new ways of doing more than making do, of creatively repurposing, reinventing, refocusing, if you want, to find non-traditional solutions, to actually create the kinds of products that are going to make our country prosper in the 21st century. Under jugaad, what you had the Indian villager constructing a makeshift vehicle. He takes a bullock cart's cart, he takes an irrigation hand pump to make it as an engine, he puts rubber on his wooden wheels, and he suddenly got instead of a bullock cart, he's got a cart that he can actually drive with this irrigation hand pump pushing him along. We've got to go beyond that. I mean, that's fine, that's clever, good for him. It obviously has no lasting value. Common machines and household objects are reincarnated today in ways their original manufacturers never intended. Have many of you seen that wonderful WhatsApp meme from Punjab about a lassi maker at the peak of summer who makes his lassi in a washing machine? Think about it. It does exactly what a mixie would do, but he can make far more industrial-sized quantities of lassi by doing it in a washing machine. And he's doing it and it's out there, and it's clever. That's the reimagining of familiar things. I mean, we are the country that invented the whole concept of the missed call, right? Your mobile phone, you can't afford to pay the bill, so you give a missed call to your dad and mom, and they can pay the bill, so they'll call you back. That's basically the Indian way. So we have already shown a capacity to reimagine things, and that's hugely important. The whole theory that the late C.K. Prahalad came up about the prophets at the bottom of the pyramid, it was a very important insight. Whoever thought the poor could be consumers? So here's somebody who can't afford to buy a bottle of shampoo, but you start marketing shampoo to him in a 5-rupee sachet and he'll buy it for his wife. So suddenly you're creating a consumer base that didn't exist. This kind of transformation is extremely important, and we're doing it, as I said, in terms of frugality. We're doing it within what we can afford. I mentioned the Nano, but think of the Mars mission, the Mangalyaan mission. You know, we became the first country in the world to actually send a Mars orbiter around Mars on the first attempt. Even the US and Europe could not succeed in their first attempt, and China and Japan still haven't succeeded. But we did it so frugally that the entire $74 million cost of our venture was less than the budget of the Hollywood space movie Gravity. And that was about 11% of the cost of NASA's Mars mission. Or other examples, the GE Mac 400, a handheld electrocardiogram that costs about $800. The cheapest alternative anywhere in the world market is $2,000. You've got the Tata Swatch, $24 water purifier. And what's interesting is, what have we done? So the GE Mac suddenly reduces all the buttons on your cardiogram to 4. It reduces the printer, that big machine there, into a tiny portable thing like the ones the waiters bring you at a restaurant when you're giving your credit card. They make it small enough to fit into a satchel or a knapsack. It can even run on batteries, so it can run in places where there's no reliable electricity. And the total cost of an ECG is now about $1 per patient, which means that you can actually go off and give ECGs to poor people who are dying because they couldn't afford one before. That's the kind of change we need to have in our country. And there are many more examples, but I want to save us time. Just to stick to medicine for a minute, you know that the cheapest hepatitis B vaccine was invented by an Indian biotech firm. It used to be $15 for a hepatitis B vaccine injection. Today, thanks to an Indian firm, it's down to 10 cents. Insulin's price has fallen by 40%, again because of an Indian biotech firm. These are the kinds of frugal innovations I'm talking about, and I think we will have to think about that in automobiles as well. I used to constantly break and misplace my glasses. So a friend of mine gave me an example of out-of-the-box thinking. He said, "What's your problem?" I said, "The problem is that for 150 years, all glasses are worn on the nose and rest on your ears. I find that uncomfortable because for me, I only need glasses for distance. So I wear them barely 5% of the day. Why should I have something sitting on my face bothering my nose and my ears the whole time?" So that's why I put them in a pocket, or I leave them somewhere, or I drop them off my lap, somebody steps on them. That's why I break so many glasses. So then he came back with this wonderfully creative solution. What I'm wearing around my neck. It's around my neck, so I don't misplace it, I don't put it down, I don't lose it, I can forget about it until I need it. And when I do need to recognize somebody at the back of the room, I just click it together with a pair of magnets in the middle, and I can say hello. So there is no reason to do something because it has always been done that way. I mean, if you say glasses have always been a certain way for 150 years, they can be made differently. The same with cars, and that's what you also have to think about. Now, I want to bring this to a close so we can take a couple of questions. So let me move from the question of agility and innovation to my final point, which is that to deliver results and quality, we need real clarity of purpose. You're looking at leadership, at controlling your destiny. You really need to know what exactly it is that you're trying to accomplish. To my mind, in the automobile world, this points to sustainability. We need to emphasize, as I said, innovation and quality, but we also need to think about preserving our earth. If you folks are going to be ending up polluting us, already we live in a city where the air is so unbreathable that the New York Times correspondent resigned prematurely and wrote an article saying that as a father, I consider it irresponsible of me to bring up my 8-year-old child in the city because it's going to kill him. That's the reaction to our air quality problems of one foreigner. A foreigner can move to New York. We can't. We really have to find solutions within the automobile industry as well to things of this kind of nature. There are destructive and reviving forces around us, but surely we have to care that the vehicles we make are polluting our atmosphere, destroying the lungs of our children, and shortening their lifespans. The truth is that environmental challenges have affected people everywhere, whether it's Gdansk or Goa, whether it's Delhi or Dili in East Timor. The fact is that we must therefore look at the longer term picture. And to my mind, working in partnership with the media, with civil society, with NGOs, even with politicians, so that we can work together to find solutions, even in your industry, that will enable you to get people to move around in your vehicles, enable you to sell more vehicles, enable you to increase your profits, but at the same time play a socially responsible part in ensuring that we're not destroying our environment in so doing. The truth is that greener and cleaner vehicles are unavoidable in the 21st century. A switch to alternative fuels and hybrids is indispensable. The rise of electric vehicles, dual fuel vehicles, all of these has been getting encouragement from a point of view of regulation and consumer awareness. You really have to take this challenge by your hands, and I think eventually it will benefit not only your businesses, it will benefit your children, the future generations who have to live in this country. Now, I'm going to end here on that note, but it would be odd for an Indian politician to end a speech without quoting Mahatma Gandhi. So let me live up to your expectations and do so. And I won't use one of his better-known quotes. I'll say simply something Gandhiji said very interestingly. He said, "It's the quality of our work which will please God and not the quantity." Now, he, of course, also famously declared, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Since quality will not come without change, since the automobile industry has focused much more on quantity than on quality sometimes, I think both exhortations apply to all of you in this room. Change yourselves to change the world, and do so with work and values of the highest quality. I'm sure these two thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi can illuminate your quest for continued accomplishment in all aspects of your life and work, and that we can together not only control our destiny, but that of this country, so it can go on to a glorious future in the 21st century. Thank you. Jai Hind.